The door was unlocked. That was the first thing, not the light in the window at 3 a.m., not the sound I thought I heard from the street below, but the fact that when I pressed my hand against the door of Jonah's apartment it swung open without resistance, without the familiar two-beat click of the deadbolt that I had heard 1,000 times. Just open. Like it had been waiting. My name is Maya. I was 31 years old, a freelance graphic designer living in Ashford, Oregon, and I had been with Jonah Mercer for 2 years and 4 months, a relationship I had organized a significant portion of my identity around without fully realizing I was doing it. I had his door code. I had a drawer in his bathroom. I had, more importantly, a version of myself that existed specifically inside our relationship, quieter than the Maya outside it, more careful, more attuned to the small atmospheric shifts that meant the difference between a good evening and a difficult one. I had come because I'd forgotten my laptop charger. That's the whole mundane machinery of it. I'd been working at his place that afternoon, left around 8 when he said he wanted an early night, and made it all the way to my own apartment before realizing the charger was still plugged into the wall beside his couch. I needed it. I had a client deadline at 8 a.m. and my battery was at 11%. So I drove back across Ashford at 3 a.m. on a Thursday in October, telling myself I'd slip in quietly, grab it, leave. The door swung open. I registered the living room first, the lamp on the side table, the one Jonah always left on low when he went to sleep, casting its amber circle across the floor. 2 wine glasses on the coffee table. One mostly empty, one with a lipstick mark on the rim. Jonah didn't wear lipstick. I did sometimes, but not that day, and not that shade. The shade on the glass was a deep berry, the color of something deliberate and dressed up, the kind you put on before you go somewhere. I stood in the doorway for a second that lasted a long time. And then Tess walked out of the kitchen. Tess Larkin. My best friend since the second semester of junior year in college, the woman I had called first after every breakup and every job loss and the night my father had his cardiac event. The woman who had known my therapist's name and my childhood dog's name and every important piece of interior geography I owned. Tess, in Jonah's kitchen, at 3 a.m., in a silk top I recognized because I had been with her when she bought it, wearing that lipstick, holding a dish towel with the particular domesticity of someone who had been here before. She stopped when she saw me. The sound that came out of me was not a word. It was somewhere between a syllable and a breath. Then Jonah appeared from the hallway in a t-shirt and sleep pants, saw my face, and the thing that happened in his expression was very fast and very controlled, a microsecond of something true, followed immediately by the version he decided I was going to receive. Maya. His voice was sleep-rough and slightly incredulous, as if I were the unusual element in this arrangement. What are you doing here? And then, before I could find a single one of the 1,000 things trying to exit my body simultaneously, Tess said, in a voice that was perfectly steady, Maya, this isn't what it looks like. I stood in the doorway of my boyfriend's apartment at 3 a.m. and looked at my best friend standing in his kitchen with his dish towel and her lipstick, and the wine glasses on the table between us, and something inside me did a very quiet, very permanent thing. Not breaking. Something more like the opposite. Like something that had been bending for a long time finally going still. Here's what I knew about Jonah Mercer before I knew what I knew. He was brilliant and he was difficult, and the combination had felt, in the beginning, like a kind of electricity. We had met at an art opening, he was there for the architecture, I was there for the print design, and we had ended up talking for 2 hours in a corner about negative space and then splitting a bottle of wine at the bar next door. He was confident in a way that felt, at 33, refreshingly assured rather than arrogant. He had opinions. He defended them. He was interested in my work in a way that felt genuinely curious rather than performative. In the beginning it was real. I want to say that clearly because it matters, not as an excuse for what I tolerated later, but as an explanation for why I tolerated it. There was something between us that was genuine, something warm and specific and alive, and it did not turn into its replacement overnight. It turned slowly, through a series of small adjustments so incremental that I made most of them without noticing I was being asked to. The first adjustment, my opinions. Jonah had a way with disagreement that was hard to name precisely. He didn't shout, didn't sulk, didn't issue ultimatums. What he did was something more sophisticated. He made you feel, through careful questioning and quiet persistence, that your position was not quite as well reasoned as you'd thought. He would ask follow-up questions until the original point had been walked so far from its source that defending it felt exhausting. I started, by the 4th or 5th month, self-editing before I spoke. Choosing the version of my opinion that was closest to his, then adjusting from there. I told myself this was growth, learning to think more rigorously. I did not name it as what it was. The second adjustment, Tess. Jonah had never said he didn't like Tess. He was careful about that, careful enough that there was nothing I could have pointed to and called unfair. He said she was a lot, sometimes, with a small smile that I had laughed at because it was true. Tess was a lot, she was vivid and loud and took up space, and those were things I loved about her. He said her priorities seemed scattered, that he wasn't sure she was the best influence when I had a deadline. He said, once, that he sometimes felt like I was a different person after I spent time with her, less settled, more restless, and then it worried him. I began seeing Tess less. Not dramatically, not all at once, just slightly less often, slightly less easily, with a slightly increased awareness of how I would describe the evening to Jonah afterward and whether the description would concern him. I called it being considerate of his needs. I understand now what it was. Tess, for her part, said nothing. Not about Jonah's comments, not about seeing me less, not about the way I had started to soften and qualify my stories in a way she had once told me was not my natural mode. Looking back, I understand her silence differently than I did at the time. At the time I read it as acceptance. She was adjusting, as I was adjusting, to the new configurations of my life. Now I understand she had her own reasons to keep the peace. There were signs I named wrong. A pattern I should have read correctly and chose, repeatedly, to translate into something that fit the story I needed to be true. The first one that surfaces clearly now, about 8 months in, I showed Jonah a pitch deck I'd spent 2 weeks building for a major client, a rebranding project for a regional arts nonprofit, the kind of work I wanted more of. I was proud of it. He looked at it for a long time and said, "It's strong. But is it really you? Or is it what you think they want?" I revised the deck. I showed him the revision. He said it was better. I sent the revision. I did not get the project. I didn't wonder, then, whether his feedback had been calibrated to steer me away from my own instincts. I didn't wonder whether a man who consistently responded to my professional confidence with a gentle question about whether my instincts were reliable was doing something that had a name. I wondered whether my instincts were reliable. By the time I found Tess in his kitchen, I had been living inside that question for almost 2 years. The morning after I found them, I need to be precise about what happened, because the conversation was the kind that is specifically designed to make you doubt the reliability of your own perception. I had not slept. I had driven home at 3 a.m. with my charger in my passenger seat and sat at my desk until daylight and then sat on my couch and then paced my apartment in the specific way of someone whose body is trying to outrun something her mind is still processing. Jonah called at 8:14 a.m. "I've been thinking about last night," he said, "and I'm worried about you." Not, "I know what you saw and I owe you an explanation." Not, "I understand why this looks bad." Worried. About me. Tess came over because she was upset. She'd had a fight with someone she's been seeing and she needed somewhere to go and she called me because she didn't want to bother you with it. She knows how much pressure you're under with the Harmon deadline. I sat with the phone pressed to my ear. Outside, Ashford was doing its morning things, birds, a garbage truck somewhere, someone's dog. I could hear all of it with strange clarity. "The wine glasses," I said. We had a glass of wine while she talked. Maya. We had a glass of wine. "I don't understand what you think you walked in on." She was wearing that top. The silk one. A pause. When Jonah spoke again, his voice had acquired the specific patient quality that I had learned, over 28 months, to dread more than his anger. She came from wherever she'd been. She was dressed. I'm not sure what you want me to say about what she was wearing. Later that day, Tess called. Her voice was careful in a way it had never been with me before, the voice of someone choosing words from a curated list. I'm sorry you got scared, she said. Not, I'm sorry for what you saw. Sorry that I had felt something. As if the feeling was the problem. I was upset and I didn't want to call you because you have the deadline and Jonah has been so good to talk to lately. Lately, I said. A beat. He's become someone I trust. As a friend. To both of us. Is that, Maya, is there something specific you're saying? There it was. The reframe. Is there something specific you're saying, as if naming what I suspected required me to be specific and certain and formally accusatory, as if the act of wondering aloud was the breach of etiquette. I don't know, I said. Because I didn't. Because the two of them had spent the past 12 hours making it very difficult to know. That was the beginning of the not knowing. Which, I would come to understand, was not an accident. The Harmon deadline passed. I delivered the project on time. I always delivered on time. It was one of the few things about myself I had not allowed Jonah to question, and in the flat, anticlimactic space that followed a finished project, I had nothing left to hide inside. I started to look. Not frantically, not obsessively, with the careful, deliberate attention of someone who has decided she is allowed to trust what she observes. The phone patterns were the first thing. Jonah and I had a loose arrangement, not a rule, just an organic habit, of usually texting each other sometime in the mid-evening if we weren't together. The frequency and warmth of those texts had changed. Not disappeared, not drastically altered, just shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible unless you were paying the kind of close attention I was now paying. They arrived at slightly different times. They had a slightly different quality, a precision where there had previously been ramble. As if they were being composed with a different awareness of time. The second thing, Jonah had begun, subtly and with great skill, to place small questions inside our conversations about my mental state. How are you sleeping? He would ask, with a concern so genuine seeming that I had, in the first weeks after the 3 a.m. visit, found it comforting. You seem like you're in your head. Are you taking care of yourself? These questions would arrive most reliably in moments when I had said something observational, something I'd noticed, some small inconsistency I had made the mistake of mentioning. The questions were not aggressive. They were tender. They positioned my noticing as a symptom. I had a client named Deb, a woman in her late 50s who ran a small independent bookshop and needed a refresh of her brand identity. I had coffee with her 3 times over the Harmon project to discuss direction, and those coffees were the most straightforward human contact I had during that period, because Deb was entirely uninterested in my personal life and entirely interested in whether her new logo felt warm without feeling cluttered. I found the simplicity of her questions restoring. In the second coffee, Deb said something offhand that stayed with me. We were talking about font choices, the way certain fonts feel authoritative in a way that actually distances the reader, and she said, the thing about design that most people misunderstand is that the most manipulative work always looks effortless. The control is invisible. That's the whole point. I thought about that for a long time on the drive home. About invisibility. About the structures of control that work precisely because you cannot see them functioning. I started keeping a log. Not a diary, just a document on my laptop, password protected, factual. Dates, times, what was said, what the response had been. I had worked with enough therapists in my late 20s to know the value of an external record when your internal one is being systematically questioned. The act of writing things down, plain, specific, dated, was a way of insisting that what I had experienced was real, independent of what I was being told about it. The log entry for the Wednesday 3 weeks after the kitchen incident, mentioned to Jay that I noticed Tess hadn't responded to 2 texts in a row. He said maybe I was being intense about it and she needed space. When I pushed back, he said he worried that I was looking for problems. Used that exact phrase. Second time in 10 days. The log entry for the following Monday, Jay asked if I had talked to anyone about how I've been feeling. Asked whether I thought it might help to go back to seeing someone professionally. Said it with care. In the moment I almost said yes. Wrote this down instead. He was trying to refer me to a therapist. Not because he was concerned for my well-being. Because a woman who was already in therapy was a woman whose perceptions could be attributed to a process, a tendency, a diagnosis pending. My chest tightened with a specific, physical recognition when I wrote that entry. Not panic, clarity. The kind of clarity that arrives when you have been looking at something for weeks and the pattern finally resolves from noise into signal. This is what Tess told me, much later, when she had nothing left to protect and finally let herself be honest. I didn't witness this. She told me herself, in pieces, over 2 conversations I hadn't expected to survive. It started 8 months ago. That's the first thing she said. 8 months, not 2 years, not longer, she wanted me to know that. Jonah had reached out to her after we had an argument in February, the bad one about the Callaway project when I'd said I felt like I was disappearing and he'd said I was being dramatic. He told her he was worried about me. He said he needed someone who knew me well to help him understand what I needed. He said he loved me and was afraid of getting it wrong. She believed him. That's the part she kept returning to, she believed him because he said all the things that sounded like a person who loved someone. And then, slowly, it became something else. Something she didn't have a name for at first and named wrong when she started to. She told herself it was closeness. That they had built a friendship through the shared concern of caring about me. She let herself believe that for 8 months. The silk top, the wine glasses, the 3 a.m., by then she knew it wasn't friendship and she was in too deep to see a way out that didn't destroy everything. So she did what he asked her to do. She looked at me in that doorway and said it wasn't what it looked like, and she has not forgiven herself for it since. November in Ashford is the color of pewter and patience. The rain starts in earnest and doesn't apologize for itself, and the city folds inward the way wet cities do, more coffee shops, slower walks, the particular introspection of people spending more time inside. I had been inside myself for weeks, and I was done with it. The log had 41 entries by the first week of November. Reading them sequentially, as I did on a rainy Tuesday afternoon with a cup of tea going cold beside my laptop, was an experience I had not fully prepared for. Individually, each entry was a small thing, a comment, a reframe, a gentle question, a redirection. But sequentially they assembled into something that had a very specific shape. A shape I recognized from the professional literature I had read in my late 20s, during a period when I was trying to understand a difficult relationship with a family member. The shape had a name. I had been refusing to say the name for weeks because naming it made it fully real, and fully real meant I had been living inside it for 2 years without seeing it. But there it was in the log, patient and undeniable, 41 documented instances of my perceptions being questioned, redirected, pathologized, or dismissed by the person who said he loved me, in a pattern so consistent it could not have been accidental. I called my sister Dana on a Wednesday evening. Dana was 4 years older than me, lived in Portland, worked in social work. She had the professional vocabulary and the personal fortitude and the direct manner of someone who had spent 15 years dealing with people in crisis and had no patience for softening things that needed to be said clearly. I told her everything. The kitchen, the log, the pattern. I had not told her any of it before because I had not wanted to be the kind of person who needed to tell her sister her relationship was in crisis. I understood, as I was talking, that reluctance was itself something Jonah had cultivated, the self-consciousness about seeming dramatic, the fear of being read as unreliable, the preference for managing privately. Dana listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When I finished she was quiet for a moment and then she said, I'm going to say something and I need you to actually hear it. Okay. What you're describing is a textbook coercive control dynamic. The isolation, the pathologizing of your perceptions, the systematic erosion of your confidence in your own judgment. I'm not diagnosing your relationship from Portland. I'm telling you that what you just read me, 41 entries, is not a man who is worried about you. It's a man who needs you to doubt yourself. I had known this was what the log said. But hearing it in Dana's voice, direct, unqualified, the voice of someone with no stake in softening it, something shifted in the room. And Tess, Dana said. I don't know about Tess. Yes, you do. I sat with that. My tea was cold. Outside, the rain was pressing itself against the window in the determined way of November rain. What do? I said. Not really a question. You stop managing it quietly, Dana said. That's the first thing. The next piece of evidence arrived without my looking for it. A design colleague named Rosa, someone I worked with occasionally on collaborative projects, friendly without being close, texted me out of nowhere on a Friday asking if I wanted to grab lunch. We went to a place near her studio, and somewhere in the middle of the meal she put her fork down and said, "Can I ask you something directly?" I told her yes. I ran into Jonah and a woman at Copeland Street Bar 2 weeks ago. On a Thursday night. They seemed, I don't know how to describe it. Comfortable. And I don't know your situation, I don't know if I'm overstepping. What did she look like? Rosa's description matched Tess exactly. The hair, the height, the particular way Tess had of leaning forward when she was talking to someone she wanted to impress. They were there for at least 2 hours, Rosa said. I was there with my partner and they were there when we arrived and still there when we left. I thanked her. I paid for lunch. I drove home and added entry 42 to the log, and then I called my therapist, the one I had seen 2 years ago and dropped when Jonah had suggested, gently, that I seemed to be doing so well, that maybe the weekly appointments were creating more anxiety than they were resolving, and I made an appointment for the following Tuesday. Her name was Patricia. She had a small office above a bookshop on the west side of Ashford, and she had fern plants on the windowsill. And when I sat across from her for the first time in 18 months and said, I think someone has been systematically dismantling my trust in my own perception for 2 years, she did not look surprised. She looked like someone who had been waiting to hear from me. The conversation I needed to have could not wait any longer. Patricia agreed. Not because the evidence was complete, she was careful about that, careful to say she could only speak to what she was observing in me, not to diagnose Jonah from a description, but because staying in the uncertainty was its own kind of damage. Every week I spent not naming it was another week my nervous system spent in the low-grade hypervigilance of someone who knows something is wrong but cannot say so. What are you afraid of? Patricia asked, in our second session. I thought about it honestly. I'm afraid he'll make me believe I made it up. He's already been doing that, she said. And you didn't stop knowing what you knew. That sentence was the thing I carried out of her office and held onto for the week before I was ready. I asked Jonah to come to my apartment. Not his, mine. The distinction mattered to me in a way I didn't fully articulate even to myself until later. I needed to be in a space where the objects were mine, where the furniture had been chosen by me, where the light came through windows I had selected and the air was not arranged around his preferences. I needed the room to be on my side. He arrived at 7 on a Saturday evening in late November. He had brought wine, a bottle of the Willamette Valley Pinot we both liked, and he set it on my kitchen counter with the ease of someone who expected this to be a normal evening, or who had decided to perform the expectation of one. I did not open the wine. I sat at my kitchen table and I had the log open on my laptop and I had Dana on standby text. She had offered to come to Portland, but I had told her I needed to do this alone, which was true, and also that I needed to know I could do this alone, which was more true. Sit down, I said. He sat. He looked at my face and I watched him read it, saw the micro-calculation happen behind his eyes, the assessment of what version of this evening he was about to manage. You seem serious, he said. And something in me ignited. Not the angry crying kind of igniting, not the kind that comes from pain looking for an exit, the other kind. The kind that is fed by clarity rather than wound. I've been keeping a record, I said. Since the night I came to your apartment and found Tess there. 42 entries over 6 weeks. I'm going to read you some of them. He opened his mouth. I kept going. November 4th. You asked if I'd considered going back to therapy. This followed a conversation in which I mentioned noticing that Tess wasn't responding to my texts. You framed my noticing as a symptom. I looked up at him. November 9th. When I said I felt like I was second-guessing myself constantly, you said that sounded like anxiety and asked if I was sleeping. This followed a conversation in which I asked a direct question about how often you were talking to Tess. Maya. October 28th. When I described what I saw in your apartment, you said you were worried about me. Not about us, not about what I had witnessed, not about the explanation you were going to provide. You were worried about me. As if what I had seen was a symptom of something wrong with my perception rather than something present in your kitchen. I closed the laptop. Not because I was done, because I had said what mattered and I was not going to let a screen become the point. I want to know how long. Jonah was silent for a moment. He had the expression of a man running rapid internal calculations. I recognized it now, saw it clearly, the way you can see a magic trick once you know where the misdirection is. Maya, I think you've been building something in your head. Don't. The word came out clean and absolute. I have 42 documented instances of you redirecting my perceptions toward a question about my mental health. I have a colleague who saw you and Tess at Copeland Street Bar on a Thursday evening. I have the 3 a.m. memory, which is extremely clear, regardless of what you have told me about it. Do not sit in my kitchen and tell me I've been building something in my head. His jaw tightened. You went and talked to people about this. Yes. Without talking to me first. There it was. The same move Seth Maddox had made in the previous story, in a different kitchen, with different details, but the same structure. The pivot away from the content of the accusation toward the etiquette of its investigation. The implication that my method of discovering the truth was more problematic than the truth itself. Jonah. I kept my voice level. I talked to people because you had spent 6 weeks making me doubt whether what I saw with my own eyes was real. I needed external reference points because you had been systematically removing my confidence in my internal ones. That is why I talked to people. And I need you to hear me say that without trying to make it about my process. Something moved across his face then, something faster and less controlled than his usual register. For a fraction of a second, something that was close to recognition. As if he had heard himself described accurately for the first time and the accuracy surprised him. Then the control came back. I think this relationship has been really hard on you, he said. His voice had gone to a register I hadn't heard before, low, almost gentle, but with a quality underneath that was more careful than kind. I think you've been under a lot of pressure and I think I haven't been as attentive as I should have been and I think maybe we both need to look honestly at whether this is working. I agree, I said. It's not working. I'm ending it. He looked at me for a moment. I think he had expected tears. I think he had expected the capitulation that had come every other time he had redirected with enough skill and patience, the softening, the backtracking, the offer to hear his explanation, the willingness to wonder if I had been unreasonable. Just like that. You've been telling me for 2 years that my perceptions are unreliable, I said. I know what I saw. I know what I have documented. And I know that every time I tried to say what I noticed, you found a way to make the noticing the problem. I don't need a complete accounting of everything that happened with Tess to know that this relationship has been built on a foundation of making me smaller and less certain. That's enough. Maya, I'm being clear. For the first time in this relationship, I'm being entirely clear. I stood up. I'd like you to leave now. He sat for a moment. Then he stood. He took the wine from the counter, reached for it, and then seemed to think better of it and left it there, which was the most human thing he did all evening. At the door he paused. I do care about you. Whatever you think. I looked at him. I know you believe that, I said. That doesn't make it sufficient. I closed the door. Tess came 2 days later. I had not contacted her, she came on her own, which told me something about where she was. I opened the door and looked at her, and she looked at me, and neither of us said anything for a moment. Then I stepped back and let her in, because whatever she was here to say, I needed to hear it with the door closed. She sat on my couch. She had no silk top this time. She was wearing the kind of clothes that people wear when they're not trying to be anything, an old college sweatshirt, her hair pulled back, no lipstick. She looked like the Tess I had known for 9 years, the one I had trusted unconditionally. Looking at her, I felt grief arrive alongside the anger, both at the same time, in almost equal measure. Then she spoke for a long time. She had already told me the outline, the 8 months, the conversation about caring for me, the slow drift into something she'd named wrong. What she gave me in that sitting room conversation was the detail and the honesty that the log entries had prepared me to receive. The night you came in. When I said it wasn't what it looked like. That was the worst thing I've ever done to someone I love. I knew what it looked like. I knew exactly what it looked like. And I said it anyway because he had already told me that if you found out before he was ready to talk to you, it would be really bad for those were his words. Your stability. He used your mental health as a reason for me to protect him. And I let him. That is on me. Not on you, not on him, on me. I chose it. She stopped. Looked at her hands. I think he's someone who needs people to be less than they are so he can feel like what he is. And I think I let that happen to you for 8 months without saying a word because I was ashamed of what I was in the middle of, and telling you would have meant telling you all of it. So I didn't say any of it. And you found out anyway. And you found it out alone. The silence that followed was the longest I had shared with another person in years. Possibly ever. I don't know what happens now, I said finally. With us. I know. I need time. I know that too. She left. I sat for a while in the quiet of my apartment and let everything settle the way disturbed water settles, slowly, unevenly, taking longer than you expect. Then I texted Dana, it's done. She called within 30 seconds and I let her talk for 20 minutes, mostly listening, occasionally saying yes, and it helped in the simple, irreplaceable way that a sister can help when the particular sister is Dana. December arrived and the rain intensified and I let it. There is something I have always found steadying about Ashford in deep winter, the way the city doesn't pretend to be other than it is, gray and wet and quietly persistent, going about its business without making claims about the weather it can't support. I was going about my business. I told my clients I was doing a brief rate restructure. I raised my rates by 22% and lost 2 clients and gained 3 better ones within 6 weeks, because I had been undercharging for years in the specific way that people who have been taught to doubt their own value tend to undercharge. My instincts about the Harmon pitch deck, the original version, the one Jonah had redirected me away from, had been correct. I knew this because I rebuilt something similar for a new client and they called it the most confident work I had done for them. Confidence. That was the word. I had been competent all along. The confidence had been the thing that was being managed. Patricia and I worked through the long middle of winter. Not crisis sessions, productive ones. She helped me do what I can only describe as a structural audit, going back through the relationship not to assign blame or excavate pain, but to understand the mechanism. Where had I handed over the authority to define my own experience, and why? What had I needed so badly from Jonah that I had been willing to accept his version of me in exchange for it? The answer, when it came, was both simple and unkind to look at. I had needed someone to believe I was worth constructing a life around. I had come into that relationship with a quiet, long-standing question about my own sufficiency, not clinical, not debilitating, just the low-frequency uncertainty of someone who had always felt slightly provisional in her own life, waiting for someone authoritative to confirm she was real. Jonah had provided that confirmation, lavishly, in the first year. And then, when the confirmation became conditional, when it started to require the particular version of Maya that was smaller and more doubtful, I had paid the price. Because the original confirmation had felt so necessary that I had organized myself around not losing it. Understanding this was not comfortable. Patricia was right that it was important. Dana drove down in January. We cooked together in my kitchen for 2 days, elaborate, unnecessary meals, the kind that take the whole afternoon, with podcasts playing and the rain outside and the specific comfort of doing something physical and purposeful with someone who loves you uncritically. She didn't ask many questions. She didn't need to. She was simply there, consistently, in the way that family can be when you finally let them into the room you'd been keeping tidy for inspection. Tess and I met for coffee in February. Not gravel and grounds, that was another story's geography, and I was in my own. A place called the Sparrow on the west side of Ashford that I had been to a few times and liked for its corner tables. We were both early. We sat across from each other and ordered, and neither of us opened with anything light. "I've been thinking about what I want to say to you for months," Tess said. "Tell me." What she told me was that she had been in therapy since December. That she had named what her dynamic with Jonah had been, not a romantic relationship, she said, but something that had borrowed the emotional grammar of one, something that had served her need for intensity and importance while being directed, as she eventually understood, toward making her useful to him. She had been a tool, she said, the same as I had been a tool, just shaped differently. She was not asking me to absolve her for it. I sat with that. I looked at my coffee. I thought about 9 years, the specific density of a 9-year friendship, the weight and texture of it, the memories that belonged only to the two of us, the shorthand and the history and the person she had been when I'd needed a person to be there. "I can't go back to what we were," I said. "I know. But I don't want to throw away 9 years because of 8 months." She looked up. Something careful in her face went slightly less careful. "I don't know what the thing after this looks like," I said. "I'm not offering you certainty. I'm saying I'm willing to find out." It was the most honest thing I could give her. It was not forgiveness in the clean, complete sense. It was the willingness to remain in the same room with the complication, to continue towards something that might become trust again, slowly, without forcing the pace. She said, "That's more than I deserve." I said, "Maybe. But it's what I actually feel, so it's what I'm saying." By spring I had repainted my office. New color, a deep, saturated teal that Jonah had once said was too aggressive for a workspace and that I had agreed with and was now covering every wall with. I worked in it every morning and found it clarifying. A project came in through a referral in April, a branding suite for a new independent publishing house, the kind of work I had been reaching for years. I presented my initial concepts with the version of myself that had not been consulting anyone else's opinion about whether my instincts were sound. The client said the presentation was the most assured they had seen in the process. I did not minimize it. I said thank you and meant it straightforwardly. Small, maybe. But I had spent 2 years in a relationship that treated my confidence as a problem to solve. Saying thank you without immediately offering a qualifier felt, in the specific context of where I had been, like proof of something. The log still existed on my laptop. I opened it sometimes, not to revisit the entries but to remember that I had written them, that even in the middle of being told my perceptions were unreliable, some part of me had been keeping accurate records. Had insisted on its own account of events. Had preserved the evidence against the revision. I did not delete it. It was, in its way, the most important design work I had ever done. Patricia asked me, in our last session of the spring, what I would say to the Maya who had opened the unlocked door in October at 3 a.m. I thought about it. About the woman standing in the doorway with the wine glasses in front of her and the dish towel in Tess's hands and the sound that came out of her that was not quite a word. I'd tell her she was right, I said. Everything she thought she was seeing it. And she never stopped knowing it, even when they were very good at making her think she didn't. Patricia said, that's the thing they can't take even when they take a lot else. The part of you that keeps the accurate record. That part held. It had held. Through 2 years and 42 log entries and 1 October kitchen at 3 a.m. and 6 weeks of being told I was imagining things. It had held, and the holding was the story, and the story was mine to keep. The teal walls caught the April light in a way I had not expected, warmer than the color suggested, almost amber in certain hours of the afternoon. I noticed it every day and never stopped finding it good. That was new. Noticing something good and just letting it be good, without waiting to hear whether someone who knew better might have a question about it. That was the whole difference, in the end. I had come back to myself. Not the version they had needed me to be, the original, the one who had existed before I started editing her down for easier management. She was quieter than I remembered and more sure of things than I had allowed her to be, and she was keeping her own records from now on. She was not asking anyone's permission. What Jonah Mercer did to Maya was not passionate or explosive or identifiable from the outside. That's the specific cruelty of the kind of control this story describes. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, no moments that would have been legible to a bystander as harm. What there was instead was a 2-year project of epistemological erosion, the gradual, systematic dismantling of a woman's confidence in her own perceptions, delivered with the tenderness of someone who appeared to be deeply concerned about her well-being. The most sophisticated lie in this story is not the one about Tess. It is the one about Maya's mental health. Because redirecting a person's observations toward a question about their psychological stability is not just a deflection, it is a weaponization of care. It uses the language of love and concern to make self-doubt feel like self-knowledge. It turns the act of noticing, which is, in Maya's case, a professional skill and a fundamental act of self-preservation, into a symptom. And it does so with enough warmth and consistency that the person receiving it begins to collaborate in her own diminishment without recognizing the collaboration for what it is. The log is the moral center of this story. Not the confrontation, not the revelation, not the eventual reckoning with Tess. The log, 42 entries, written in the middle of being told she was imagining things, is the document of someone who refused, somewhere beneath the doubt, to stop insisting on the accuracy of her own experience. Maya did not need anyone to validate what she saw in that kitchen. She needed a way to hold on to it while everything around her tried to revise it. The log was that way. And it is worth noting what kind of discipline that required, to write down what you experienced clearly and factually, in the same period when the person you trusted most was gently suggesting that your perceptions were anxiety-driven and your instincts were unreliable. Tess is the story's most painful figure precisely because her betrayal was not cold. She was not cynical. She was recruited through her own vulnerability, her need for intensity, for significance, for the specific gratification of being trusted with something important, and she let that recruitment happen because naming it would have required her to name herself accurately. This is not exculpatory. She held Maya's hand for 9 years and then, when it mattered most, she stood in a kitchen at 3 a.m. and said this isn't what it looks like. That sentence, delivered to someone she loved, knowing what she knew, that was the choice. And the fact that she arrived at honest accountability eventually does not erase the cost of the 8 months she spent choosing differently. What Maya's flaw, she believed the version of herself that others needed her to be, reveals is something worth sitting with beyond this story. She was not passive. She was not weak. She was skilled, observant, professional, and capable of enormous clarity when she finally stopped filtering her own perceptions through his approval. But she had come into this relationship with a question about her own sufficiency that made her susceptible to a man who offered answers. She had accepted his editorializing about her instincts because some part of her had been waiting for an authority figure to confirm whether she was real enough. And he had understood that need, whether consciously or instinctively, and used it with precision. The recovery the story shows is not triumphant. It is accurate. The teal walls, the raised rates, the publishing house project, the coffee with Tess, none of it is a dramatic reversal. It is the quiet, daily accumulation of someone living inside her own permissions again. Trusting what she notices. Saying thank you without the qualifier. Keeping her own records. These are not small things disguised as small things. They are the actual substance of what was lost and what has to be rebuilt, not from the outside in, but from the inside out, in increments that no one sends congratulations for. The question this story leaves open is the one that matters most. How long had the version of Maya that needed someone else's authority to feel real been there, before Jonah? Because he did not create that need. He found it and used it. And the deepest work, the work Patricia was pointing toward, the work that outlasts any individual relationship, is the work of understanding how that need was built, long before anyone thought to exploit it. The thing I keep returning to, after everything in this story, is the sound Maya made in that doorway. Not a word. Somewhere between a syllable and a breath. The sound of someone who has just seen something true that they cannot yet metabolize. She tried to unsee it for 6 weeks. She was very nearly convinced. And then she started writing things down, and the writing was the act that saved her clarity, not a dramatic confrontation. Not an external rescue, not a revelation delivered by someone else. Just a woman, alone at her laptop, insisting in plain sentences on the accuracy of her own experience. There is something worth thinking about here that extends far beyond Maya's story. How often do we accept the redirection? How many times have we felt something clearly and then, because someone we trusted looked at us with concern and asked whether we were okay, filed the feeling under probably nothing, probably me? The genius of this kind of control is that it doesn't require you to disbelieve your own perceptions all at once. It just requires you to introduce enough doubt, gradually enough, that you start checking with the wrong source before you trust yourself. Maya's survival was not in the confrontation. It was in the log. In the decision, made quietly and without witness, to keep the accurate record even while the revision was being offered. Keep the accurate record. That's what I walk away with. Even when, especially when, someone you love is gently suggesting that the record needs correction. The part of you that keeps it is the part they cannot reach. Hold on to it.